Hi, welcome back to Purpose Driven Church for Unificationist. We're on day 44. Just for reference, we are about three-quarters of the way through the book, page 270, and we are starting on this section called Create an Attractive Atmosphere. And this is part of the overall section where we're looking at how to create a really amazing Sunday service experience. So creating an attractive atmosphere. So he says, atmosphere is that hard to define but unmistakable feeling you get when you enter a church service, or frankly, any place. It's often called the spirit, the mood, or the tone. Regardless of what you call it, atmosphere definitely impacts what happens in your service. It can either work for your purpose or against what you're trying to accomplish. At Saddleback, we use 5 words to describe the atmosphere we seek to create each week. So the first one is expectation. One of the common comments they get from people is that when they come to Saddleback, they get this feeling that there's like a certain sense of excitement or expectation or electricity in the air. That people are there, they're very enthusiastic, they're looking forward to the service, they're expecting that something great is going to happen, which is, pretty awesome feeling. He says, which is really awesome, what creates this sense of expectation? He says it's produced by a number of factors. He lists that members pray for the service all week. They're praying during the services. Enthusiastic members bring their unsaved friends to church. There's a history of life-changing services, so there's like precedent there. People expect it because it's the way it's been. The sheer size of the crowd, celebration-style music, and the faith of the team that leads the service. Speaking of celebration, he talks about how that's another aspect of the causes the atmosphere, is this concept of celebration, that they cultivate an atmosphere of happiness and joy. He says too many church services resemble a funeral more than a festival. Major cause of this is often the demeanor of those leading the worship. I visited some service where I felt like asking the worship leader, "Do you ever smile?" And he just uses some quotes to reinforce the idea that coming together as a family under God to be with God on a Sunday service should be a joyful thing. Next is affirmation. He says that there's so much bad news in the world, people need a place to go to hear good news. That makes sense to me. He says we want our services to be an encouragement, not a discouragement to people. Even when the message is confrontational, we start positive and we end positive. You can change a person's behavior far more quickly through affirmation than through criticism. That's really quite the statement, because otherwise it's kind of a matter of preference, and some people might say, oh well, it's better to kind of I guess in a sense push people to see their problems, but at the same give them kind of the hard truth. But what he's saying is that in his experience, people change more quickly when you affirm them, which is also something you learn through basic relationship and marriage skills as well. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. Incorporation, he says, we work hard to create a family atmosphere in our services in spite of our size. The way we greet each other at the beginning and end of each service, the way the people on stage interact with each other, and the way the pastors speak to the crowd all say, we are a family, we're in this together, you belong here. I think what's cool about that is he's not necessarily saying it's exactly the things that you say, but it's the way in which we interact with one another, the way in which people interact with each other, the way in which the people on stage interact with each other reinforces the idea that they feel like a family together, more than just the words. People are looking at the way that we're relating with one another. He says, in a world that is becoming increasingly impersonal, people are looking for a place where they feel they can belong. And then restoration. Life is tough. He says, each weekend I look into the faces of thousands of people who have been beaten up by the world all week. They have arrived with their spiritual and emotional batteries depleted. My job is to reconnect them with spiritual jumper cables to the restorative power of Christ. He says one of the purposes of the weekly service is to be spiritually restored and emotionally recharged for the new week. He's always thinking, what can I say? What can we do that's going to help people in starting their week? He says, I envision the church as a spiritual oasis in the parched desert. In Southern California especially, he says that people, they're really involved in the work life and they're in the rat race. And he says that because of that, especially, they try to bring in a lot of humor to really kind of lighten people's load in a sense. He says, Also, if you can learn to laugh at yourself, there's lots of resources for humor there. And then lastly is liberation. He says it's a sense of liberating people and the feeling of being liberated. He says we avoid stuffiness, formality, and any kind of pretentiousness in our services. Instead, we cultivate an informal, relaxed, and friendly atmosphere. We found that an informal, unpretentious service disarms the fears and defenses of the unchurched. When people feel self-conscious, they raise their emotional defenses. Since we want to communicate to these people, our first task is to reduce their anxiety so that they can drop their defenses. Once they relax, they stop thinking about themselves and are able to tune into the message. To many unchurched Americans, I think this is a really important point. I think it's very true. The word informal is a synonym for authentic, while formality suggests insincere and phony. Baby boomers especially are turned off by pomp and protocol. For this reason, we don't use reverential titles for our pastors at Saddleback. No one ever refers to me as Dr. Warren at our church. I am just called Rick. We have no dress code. What people wear to church is a cultural issue, not a theological one, so we don't make a big deal out about it. One thing we know for sure, Jesus never wore a suit and tie, so it isn't required to be Christ-like. And also just going back to the point about pomp and circumstance and protocol and titles, I know that there's a lot of people and a lot of churches where people really, emphasize their title. I'm a deacon, I'm an elder, I'm a whatever. Just frankly speaking, especially in the context of church, like young people they just don't care about titles because the title doesn't necessarily reflect anything about who you are. It just means that you have a paper or you are a certain age or something like that, have done certain things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're somebody that they will respect or look up to. All right, so that is all for now. I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.